March 15 was a pivotal moment.
Horror in Christchurch this afternoon after shootings at two mosques in the city, with witnesses reporting seeing a man enter the mosque opposite Hagley Park dressed in a military jacket, and he just started shooting, they say.
It is clear that this can now only be described as a terrorist attack.
The terror was real on March the 15th, 2019, and just as the country began to recover,
we begin tonight with a terrorist attack in an Auckland supermarket that's left multiple people injured and the alleged offender fatally shot by police.
And as our terror grew, so too did the number of disturbing headlines.
So the Proud Boys are an extreme far-right group. They have been organising in New Zealand.
Now, very quietly, the government is planning to overhaul our terror laws. But critics have concerns.
It's early stages, but it seems like it's something that could quite easily animate or light a fire under a lot of these rights groups who are concerned.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, the secretive closed-door plans to change the country's terror laws. What is potentially changing and why? And could these changes suppress free speech and legitimate protest?
I am an Arab woman of colour, and we come in all shades of anger.
Today I'm talking to Newsroom National Affairs Editor Sam Sachdeva and University of Waikato terrorism and firearms expert Alexander Gillespie. Sam first, and I started by asking him for some background on the current terror law and what changes are in the pipeline.
It dates back to 2002, well, arguably even the year before that, the September 11 terror attacks, and that was when the Labour government at the time, Helen Clark's government, said, look, we need to update our terror laws to deal with groups like Al-Qaeda and make sure that we can tackle them in anything that they might want to do in New Zealand. So part of that legislation set up the process of designating terror entities, which sounds very technical, but it's basically just saying, you know, we formally acknowledge or formally state that this group is a terror group, and if you provide support to it or if you help them with their activities, then that is a breach of our law. So that's the sort of fundamental legislation, one of the key pieces of terror legislation in New Zealand. And what the government is doing or saying is, look, it hasn't had a fundamental update since 2002. We're 2 decades on. We need to look at this again and see whether it's fit for purpose. So they've said, you know, look, we need to make a number of changes. And I should stress this is still all very hypothetical at the moment. So what has happened is the Ministry of Justice has gone out to sort of some hand-picked groups and said, look, this is what we're thinking about doing. What do you think? You know, is this right? Is this wrong? So some of the key areas that they're looking at is making membership of a terrorist entity a criminal offence. So that's not the case at the moment. And they want to create some other new offences. So if you make a public expression of support for a terrorist act or a terrorist entity, like if you're showing some sort of logo or sharing a propaganda, then that should be an offence, is what they're saying. There's a few other bits and pieces to it, but those are the elements that are probably the most significant and have created the most controversy.
Before we talk about that controversy, it should be noted that minor changes were made to the law after March 15.
To the latest on that terror attack in New Zealand. This morning, the Prime Minister announced gun law reforms will be coming within the next 10 days after 50 people were killed in those attacks on 2 mosques.
Then the law was tweaked again 2 years later following another terror attack.
There is a gap in New Zealand law, and this bill creates offences to close that gap. The nature of terrorism has been changing, and we are seeing more lone actors and small groups rather than large organised terrorist groups. And we need to ensure New Zealand has laws that can respond to such change.
I think that's part of what the government is saying is, look, we've had a lot that's changed, not just internationally, but domestically. So let's have a look at what we have in place and see, you know, is it right as it is, or do we need to sort of bring it into the modern era?
Critics, though, say the changes could infringe on civil liberties. I mean, what's the legal community saying about that? What are the fears?
Yeah, look, I think there's always a fine balancing act, and that's what people have said to me, law professors and others, between dealing with terrorism and anything that sort of encourages violence against groups or against people, and legitimate political speech that might be, sort of not something that most New Zealanders think, but is a perspective that's entitled to be held. So the question is always, where do you draw the line there? I think terror acts, actual violence, clearly that's beyond the pale. But when you come down to speech in particular, what people are saying in public or saying online, that's when it gets a little bit murky. And the view from some groups, the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties in particular, is that there are some risks here that the changes the government is making could actually end up being used to, suppress free speech. So stuff that is, maybe politically contentious, but actually shouldn't, in their mind, be construed as supporting terrorism or terror groups.
What is the government saying in reply? Are they replying at all?
Yes, they have emphasised that this is still at a very early stage. I've spoken to or received statements from the Justice Minister, Paul Goldsmith, a couple of times this week, and they've said, look, this is exploratory. We haven't made any final decisions. There's no official government position yet. But they've said, look, in addition, we value freedom of speech. We value political protest. There are some safeguards in the legislation that's there at the moment, and we don't want to weaken those in any way. So their view is, no, this is necessary. This is what we have to do to update the Act and modernise it, but no, we don't want to infringe on people's civil liberties.
It all seems quite cloak and dagger, secretive, behind closed doors. Is that fair, and what's prompting that?
Yeah, look, that's certainly the view of the Council for Civil Liberties. They're saying, look, this is national, anything about national security and changes like this in particular that might touch on elements of free speech, that is significant enough that you should be bringing the public in at an earlier point. There are differing views on that. I've spoken to some who say, look, it makes sense to speak to the experts early on, as long as you have public consultation and allow everyone to have their views at a later point. And that would, of course, happen when the legislation, if there is legislation, goes before Parliament. You'd have the normal select committee process. But yeah, there are certainly some that feel, given the significance of this, you should bring people into the conversation earlier on.
And what about Labour, the Greens, the Māori Party? What are they saying on this?
They're being pretty cautious so far, I think mainly because they haven't seen the substance of the proposals, and that's another element of contention. Should the parties be consulted or briefed on this earlier on? And the Justice Minister's office says, not yet, but if we deem it necessary, we will do it further down the line. I spoke to the Labour leader, Chris Hipkins, and he said, look, we haven't seen what changes the government's making, but we need to see the details, and I'll just quote him directly. As with all of these things, definition matters. We want to have a country where we're not supporting terrorist organisations, and we're not encouraging support for terrorist organisations, but we've also got to be very careful about where the fine line is between legitimate protest and supporting terrorist activity. So it's a similar argument that others have made, like, yes, we need to deal with terrorism, but we need to be careful about where that line is drawn.
And the likelihood of another terror attack or incident, what are you hearing? What are people saying?
Look, I think we live in what probably our intelligence agencies or politicians would say is an elevated threat environment. There's a lot going on in the world. You've got the Russian war in Ukraine, Israel's war in Gaza. So that's inflaming tensions, I think, and that always leads to a heightened risk. And then we've seen, we've talked about March 15 and Newland. We're clearly not immune to these sort of lone wolf attacks, which have been spoken about. So the terror level, I think, has sort of hovered around medium, sometimes tipped up to high. I don't know where it is exactly at the moment, but I think there's an awareness that we're certainly not as immune as we might have thought we were in the past.
The country's terrorism innocence was shattered in 1985 with the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior.
It's described as the first act of terrorism against New Zealand, and Greenpeace photographer Fernando Pereira was killed in the blast.
Professor of International Law, Al Gillespie, speaking to The Detail from Vienna in the middle of the night, says the terror threat has been lingering in New Zealand for much longer.
There were incidents in the mid-1970s where there were some planned terror attacks against the Indian embassy, which didn't happen but were very close, which could have been a spectacular international event if it had occurred. You almost had allegedly an assassination attempt on the Queen in 1981. the town hall bombing, and you had Neil Roberts, the anarchist bomber who tried to blow up the Whanganui Computer Centre. And so our record it's definitely there. There's always been individuals who have been willing to use violence to make a statement or to try to change policy. It's just that it takes extreme events like what happened in Christchurch or some of the actions that followed with the COVID-19 protests.
Fires, fury and forklifts have seen what could be the end of the protest at Parliament. Protesters who have occupied Parliament's lawn for more than 3 weeks were pushed back when a massive surge of police late tore tents off Parliament's lawn, clearing about a third of it in a matter of minutes. Protesters tried to resist, hurling objects at officers before a fire was started in the remaining area of occupation, sending thick smoke across Parliament's grounds.
That make you realise that I think that the violence was, we did well as a society to avoid it and tolerate, as we should have, as much free speech. But I think it was close. But the authorities did well to make sure everything was maintained.
Al Gillespie points out that New Zealand is often late to lawmaking in this area and tends to react rather than being proactive.
Terrorism is something which has been with countries for most of the 20th century, and it was something which didn't really hit New Zealand until the 1980s, and then we had the Rainbow Warrior, and that was when we got our first significant terrorism-related laws. And the next sequence was after 2001 with the September 11th attack in the United States. And so we tend to have the law after an event, and it's only then that we start to kind of respond. And I think the government has been looking at recent changes in New Zealand and challenges overseas and have thought that this is a good time to take stock over what we've got and whether it's adequate, because the current law, although it's been built on post-2002, is still quite clunky, and this is a chance to kind of make sure it's fit for purpose, and people can think of everything not just from the current concerns around the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, but you can also think about like COVID-19 and how people's tensions started to rise quite considerably, and some of the responses were not what you'd expect. And so it's a good time to be thinking about, does this law work now and what's foreseeable in the future?
So you agree that they do need tightening. What do you think needs changing, tweaked, made better?
There's a lot of aspect to this law and to the people and entities it covers, and everyone's going to have a particular focus of where they think that the change needs to be. And so it ranges not just from support for terrorist groups, it's also about how you would define terrorism, how you would deal with people who have been convicted of terrorism, and the balance that you strike in a free, tolerant, cosmopolitan society against those who are willing to advocate or use violence against other civilians or citizens. And so it's a very difficult process because you want to make sure that people are allowed to speak as freely as possible, and we tolerate difficult discussions, but not to the point where there's a clear and present threat where someone's advocating the use of violence to change policy.
Because these proposed changes, do you think they are legally sound from what you've seen and heard, or are we at risk of undermining sort of fundamental rights?
The right to protest and the right to disagree in a democracy is one of our most fundamental values, and we've got to be very careful about undermining it. But on the other hand, we've become quite blasé with threatening uses of language involving violence as a way to justify change. And the risk is that language is either applied to a negative purpose in New Zealand or further negative actions overseas where people use violence to change policy. And it's not just the looseness of language. I think a lot of people are currently feeling very frustrated by the lack of progress over certain inertia around the world where you can't get answers, and that's causing people to say, well, maybe violence is justified.
One of the concerns is that it could lead to people being labelled as a terrorist before they've actually done anything wrong. From what you've seen, is this a serious concern? Could this happen?
Where a lot of this will turn upon is around the designation of the groups in question, and you want to make sure that process is not done lightly, because the implications of supporting that group or that person could have severe consequences. So you want to have a robust process where you hear both sides of the argument. And the tighter that is, the better it will be, because you don't want people being arrested because they're wearing a scarf of a group that you disagree with, or that they're singing a song which is ambiguous that you disagree with. But you may want those people to be legally dealt with if they're actively supporting people who are advocating the use of violence against civilians. And this will be hard to achieve legally, which is why that mechanism of designation is so important. But there's also a limit to what you can achieve, and that is that we're dealing with the information that you can see in the open. You're not dealing with the information you can see on the dark net or the stuff which is beneath the surface. And this also creates a gap because we don't have good laws around hate speech. And so we've got to be trying to create a tolerant society, but not one that utilises extreme hate or threats of violence against civilians. And so this will get hard, but the government's right to be looking at it, but not just with regards to this aspect of dealing with who may be in support of a group. We also need to be thinking about things like what's happened with COVID-19 and the use of sabotage, and so why that wasn't dealt with as a terrorist activity. And thinking also about the people who are convicted of terrorism and then use the existing platforms for notoriety. And we need to be thinking about, like, how do we hold these people in incarceration? What rights do they have? What limits are fair? And these are things we've never had to previously think about. And so to me, the law is big, and it's something that we need to be doing carefully, but it's correct to be doing it because the one thing which is certain is there will be more acts of terror. And the best we can do is be prepared to make sure that our laws and our policy and our security agencies are best prepared to stop those as much as possible.
We've got loosely the Proud Boys, who we understand have little factions in New Zealand, but do we have any other sort of terror groups or terrorists, so to speak, in New Zealand at the moment?
There's definitely some right-wing groups. There's identity groups. There's groups which kind of blur, or individuals that blur between identity politics, religious politics, traditional left-wing, right-wing politics. And so it's getting often increasingly difficult to put one group in one basket, or one individual, but they are there. And it's important to try to control some of this rhetoric. But one of the greater challenges that we've got from Christchurch is sometimes those who are going to do terror aren't visible. They're not the ones who are out making the protests. They're the ones who are quietly behind the scenes, intentionally staying beneath the radar to cause chaos. But they are being inspired and fed by some of this rhetoric around them.
He says the risk of terrorism will always be there.
You can never remove it to zero, but you can reduce the risks. And part of reducing that risk is making sure that our law is as good as it can be, that the balance between civil liberties and risk is correct, and that we have proportionate penalties to those who are willing to advocate the use of violence against civilians. When I look back over recent times, our laws weren't fit for purpose, and now we need to be thinking, what's the next step we can do?
So, to get our law right, is the government taking inspiration or the lead from other countries? Here's Sam Sachdeva again.
There are certainly similar rules or policies in place in the UK, and that's what's created a lot of attention because there's been a fairly high-profile case over there, the Palestine Action Group, which has been around for a few years now. They have a history of vandalism, breaking into companies connected to the Israeli government or the Israeli military and spray painting or graffitiing the offices, which is clearly, not pleasant and is a criminal offence. But what sort of kicked this off is earlier this year they broke into an Air Force base and tipped paint or sprayed paint over some of the British Air Force planes that have been connected to surveillance operations in the Middle East. And that's led to the British government actually formally prescribing them as a terror group. And they have this clause where if you're expressing support for a terror group, that is a breach, which is what our government is looking at doing. So you've had people with placards saying, I support Palestine Action, who have been arrested in taken away by police and charged with a criminal offence. It's actually gone beyond that at points. There have been a couple of isolated cases where you've had, someone with a shirt saying Free Gaza or I support Palestine, and not Palestine action to be clear, just Palestine, but police have pulled them up and suggested they might be in breach of the laws. So that's the concern I think that some over New Zealand have, that if we were to have any replication of what's happening in the UK, that would be, a breach of our rights and freedoms.
Do we have any idea when these laws will come into effect and, what people should be perhaps watching out for?
Not at the moment. So the sort of private consultation process that goes until early August, I think the end of the first week of August, and then I imagine it'll take probably officials at least a month or two to work through that and then go back to the Minister's office with some recommendations. So I would certainly expect we wouldn't see any introduction of legislation probably until at least the end of this year, if not later. I could be wrong, but it's one of those things where you would hope certainly the government would want to take its time and get this right.
And do we know if there are changes coming, this will come with sort of increased funding or resources for counter-terrorism?
Great question. I don't think that's been articulated yet from the Minister's office, but one would assume that would tend to go hand in hand. I certainly imagine the various agencies like New Zealand Police, the Ministry of Justice and the intelligence agencies might say, look, if you're asking us to do more and to keep an eye on a wider range of people, we're going to need the funding and the people to do that. So yes, it wouldn't shock me if they do decide to go ahead with this, that we might see some sort of budget bid next year ahead of the election.
You just said police. I mean, what are police and intelligence agents saying? Do they sort of believe the current laws are failing to keep us safe?
I haven't heard anything from police or intelligence agencies so far. I think they just try to stay away to some extent from delving into this. But they've certainly spoken, the intelligence agencies and police, about the threat environment and the sort of more challenging situation the world finds itself in and what that means for New Zealand. I think the SIS and GCSB heads have spoken about that at previous appearances at Parliament and ditto for the police. So in terms of whether the current laws are fit for purpose, I think they're sort of leaving that with the Ministry of Justice for now, but I think they're under no illusions that they've got a more challenging task on their hands.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Sam Suchdeva and Al Gillespie. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Jeremy Veal. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.